All right, Alexander, we are going to be doing a YouTube premiere. This is a premiere. It's not a live stream. It is a premiere. We thought we'd try something new today. We won't be able to do a live stream because of certain time constraints, but we will do a live stream most likely on Monday or Tuesday. I'll announce it to the community and to on our locals news feed as well. If it'll be Monday or Tuesday, most likely Monday, the usual time that we do live streams, I believe 13 o'clock LDN time, London time. And we'll be doing a premiere. And we've done one of these in the past, Alexander. So the premiere, everyone will be able to watch the video. You'll see the chat as well on YouTube, as well as on locals. And I'll also try to jump into the chat today as well. And let's see how it goes. Once again, it's not live, but it's like a premiere. It's kind of like a pre-recorded live feature that YouTube offers. But we thought we'd do this because we want to kind of cover a lot of ground today. Even though we have some time constraints, we wanted to get a lot of information out to the community because there's a lot going on in the U.S. and the U.S. economy. There's also, Alexander, it's kind of related, a lot going on with Russiagate as well, with information coming out about the DNC hack, which may have not been a hack, and with Andrew McCabe, with Andrew McCabe as well. But the big news that we'll cover in the first part of this premiere video is the U.S. economy, Alexander, which is just completely falling apart. I mean, completely falling apart. And by the way, before we get to the McCabe stuff, I would also like your comments on the Russia Energy Week before we get to the McCabe story. So let's talk about first the U.S. economy, because we are going to talk about energy and we are going to talk about the shortages. And Alexander, the before times, I don't know if you've heard about this, but CNN was calling the time period pre-coup the before times, and now you have the new times. That's how CNN was phrasing it, the before times. The before times seemed like it was a lot better time. No shortages. The economy was firing on all cylinders. Things looked really, really good for the United States. And just in a matter of months, maybe half a year, the wheels have come absolutely, completely off. The jobs report was beyond bad. People don't want to work. Shortages on the grocery shelves. I saw videos of all the tankers that are piling up, just waiting to enter the port. They haven't even entered the port. They're just kind of just waiting in like a floating pattern. What is going on here? This is, we should be worried, but is this gonna get a lot worse? Is this gonna be semi-permanent, i.e., not a short-term thing, a medium, long-term thing? How do you see things?
It is going to get worse. And of course, I should quickly say it was what we predicted at the start of this year when we saw the direction of economic policy in the United States after the Biden-Harris administration came in. But I have to say that even I am, who predicted this, am astonished at the speed of the deterioration. Let's just take a step back and look at some of the underlying things that are happening. First of all, jobs report was awful. As you absolutely rightly said, people are not working or choosing not to work. There is a growing decline in the amount of people who are actually working in the United States. I mean, the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate may not be particularly high, but that's only because many people are choosing not to work. They're just taking time off. They're basically giving up working. There's even been some talk now of a growing of, in effect, a kind of strike wave. I saw Robert Reich, who was one of Bill Clinton's economic people back in the 90s. He's actually sort of hailing this event as proof that organized labor is back. And in fact, what we have is some kind of concealed strike wave taking place across the United States. Well, that's one way of putting it. It seems to me a much more simple way of putting it is that the incentives against working are now so strong, not just in the United States, but around the world, that more and more people are just giving up. And that is the real state of play. And when you're talking about what the incentives, the disincentives to working are, the short answer is that disposable incomes are falling. The rate of inflation in the United States is higher than the rise in wages. People's living standards are falling, and they're falling so fast, and they're coming under so much pressure that more and more of them are saying, why bother to work at all in a situation like this, especially when the government at the moment is still paying me quite a lot of money, which means that I don't have to work as I did. Now, I'm glad you brought up the question of what happened before the pandemic, because, of course, if you look at the situation before the pandemic, the economy was booming, real wages were rising, disposable income was growing. We had an economy that, with its many problems, and the United States had many problems going into the pandemic, but with all of those problems, overall, it had been doing well for several years under the previous administration, and people's incomes and their livelihoods and their living standards had got better. Now everything is getting worse, and it's getting worse at one and the same time. So we have higher inflation. Inflation is now spreading to affect more and more goods. It's clearly becoming entrenched. The administration is surprised at how wide and deep the inflation is. We see a decline in labour participation. In other words, people are not working. We are seeing increasing supply chain problems, and they're not just supply chain problems in the United States. They're now affecting the entire industrialized world. We see empty shelves. We see stories about microchip shortages. We see stories about shortages of practically everything. And on top of all of that, we talked about this, we discussed this in a recent program. We talked about how the major beneficiaries at the moment of these economic disruptions are the Chinese and the Russians, how the United States is having to import ever more amounts of goods from China to try to satisfy needs in the United States. We also learn about how the United States is now having to import oil, and it's now there's been a meeting with a Russian deputy prime minister in Washington. A Russian deputy prime minister, a man called Overchuk, is currently in the United States, where he's meeting American business leaders, and he's also meeting American officials. And that's all about trying to get more energy imported from Russia into the United States, and also to try to get the Russians to agree to action to reduce oil and energy prices. And I just wanted to quickly add, the oil and energy crises are going to be a major factor, because the inflation that we see building up at the moment hasn't factored in the knock-on effect of this surge in energy prices that we have been seeing across over the last few months. So that rise in energy prices is going to lead to a further upward spiral in general prices and a further pressure on living standards, especially in Europe and in the United States.
All right, Alexander, I'm just going to share my screen here. And it's a USA Today article from 2 days ago. And it says the Biden administration looks to fix supply shortages with Walmart, UPS, and FedEx by Christmas. So basically, Biden's answer to all of this was to have UPS, Walmart, FedEx, all these companies start working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in order to fix everything. I mean, FedEx kind of already works 24 hours, 7 days a week, and so does UPS. I was under the impression. So I don't know what extra 24 hours the Biden administration is going to find, but they don't have a clue as to how to fix this, do they? I mean, they really don't, because this statement that Biden gave, which is we're just going to have all these companies that are moving stuff around and throughout the country, they just have to work more and work harder. That's his solution.
That is the solution. And of course, working harder, working more means, of course, making the workers who work with those companies work longer hours, which is, of course, exactly what the administration, when it came into office, said it wouldn't do. But let's just take a step back and unpack that. Here we see the administration telling private companies how they should run their businesses, what targets they should meet. The US government is now setting a target for Walmart to solve the supply problems by Christmas. That's what the US government is doing. Now, if that reminds you a little bit of a Soviet central planner at work, so it should, because that is exactly what Soviet central planners did. But of course, Soviet central planners, for all the many huge problems of that economic system, they did have certain levers to hand to try to get industries, factories and whatever it is to produce, to crank out those more goods, shoddy and makeshift as they might have been, in a certain space of time. What actual levers does this administration have? What can it actually do to force Walmart, for example, to actually produce more goods on its shelves by Christmas if Walmart either won't do it or can't do it because general economic conditions make it impossible? The answer is they can do nothing. So this is pure tokenism. This is language. This is a declaratory statement. We are doing something. We are talking to Walmart. We're talking to all sorts of other people, and we're going to have the problem solved by Christmas. In 1914, the British generals told the British people that the First World War would be over by Christmas. The Biden-Harris administration is telling the American people that the supply chain problems and presumably the inflation and all the other economic problems will be over by Christmas. The First World War continued beyond Christmas 1914, and I'm afraid these problems in the US economy are going to continue beyond Christmas 2021. In fact, they're going to get worse, because unless and until something is done to address the underlying problems of the US economy as we speak now, problems which, to be very clear, are directly connected to economic policy decisions the administration itself is making. Unless the administration, in other words, changes radically its economic policy, then there is no reason why these problems should be solved. On the contrary, they are going to get worse.
All right. So I've read many reports saying that the U.S. military, actually, I think the Navy is going to start dismissing people come November, I believe 28th, if they don't get jabbed up. Obviously, we had the Southwest incident. Yeah. I've heard that United and Delta are going to be letting people go as well. We've got a lot of cases where hospitals and nursing homes are letting people go as well if they don't get get the jab according to Biden's mandates, which aren't really mandates that have any legal enforcement. No. To be quite honest, they're just kind of government recommendations, which really makes me very skeptical as to why the companies are going along with them. It doesn't really quite add up, but the Federalists did a lot of legwork on those mandates, and they basically exposed the fact that the mandates really don't have any legal standing, and the White House is just putting forward a suggestion. But the companies are using that for cover in order to let people go. And it seems like, where's my point in all this? It seems like there is a concerted effort between the government and big business to just wreck the nation.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems like big business, and it just seems like there's a lot of companies, Alexander, that are saying, you know what, we'll forego the health of our business and profits for a little bit in order to just wreck everything and restart from scratch. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too conspiracy theory-esque. That's a word, conspiracy theorist. But that's how it looks to me, because your economy is going over the cliff, but everyone is they're going full speed for the mandate and for laying off people, and they're going to lay off a lot of people, and they're also going to choke transportation as well, the whole transportation infrastructure and the whole system.
Well, there you go. I mean, look, I mean, you're absolutely right to be utterly cynical and utterly skeptical and indeed incredulous about this, because we have labor shortages, we have supply chain shortages. So what do? You're going to sack lots of people, which is going to make those supply chain shortage problems, there's labor shortages, even worse. I mean, it doesn't seem on the face of it to make a great deal of sense. There may just be some economic justification on the part of some companies, in the sense that if their profits are down, if in fact they're not making profits, if they're incurring losses at the moment, which is quite likely because of the general deterioration of the economic situation, then this is a perfect way of shaking out labor, because you can just sack people, say that you're doing it for a public health reason, and at the same time you save yourself money in wages you don't have to pay. So it could be that there is an element of that. But I think overall and by and large, the true reason is partly, I suspect, because this administration is so driven by ideological considerations. And at the same time, and this is where we come back to the earlier point about the administration making declaratory statements about how it's going to sort everything out by Christmas, it doesn't really have the power to do that. So it is trying to give an impression of power by pushing companies to take this particular step, which at least makes it look as if it's able to do something which becomes effective, even though what it's actually doing, as I said, is guaranteed to make the overall economic problems worse. Now, there are some people in every economy, in every society, who thrive on chaos, or who believe they will thrive on chaos. And it's not entirely impossible that there are some people with that particular agenda who are pushing for these, frankly, I mean, irrational decisions. And one can't, unfortunately, discount that. And it's absurd to use language like conspiracy theories to talk about things like that, when we know that such people exist. But, I think that before we go all the way and adopt that as our explanation, as I said, ideology and a desire to appear to exercise control, even when you don't have it, is, in my opinion, probably the main factor which lies behind these decisions. But irrespective of what it is only guaranteed to make the situation worse.
How bad is inflation going to get? I mean, how bad can things get now?
Well, I mean, of course, that's the other problem.
Because real quick, because Janet Yellen made a statement about, I believe, like 2 weeks ago, maybe, where she said or a week ago, where she said the inflation was transitory.
Yeah, they always say that, and they've been saying that all along, that it's going to be transitory inflation. But of course, bear in mind that right at the start of this year, when people were, first saying that if there was going to be any inflation, it would be transitory, none of these people were saying that there would be supply shortages. I mean, to be very clear, the reason we have supply shortages, the reason we have labor shortages, is all connected to inflation. And the reason we have this inflation is because of this massive overspending that we've seen this year by the United States government. I mean, this has gone on at absolutely reckless speed. And of course, far from trying to dial down, the administration is pushing Congress very hard so that they can dial up. So they don't want to acknowledge that it is their own policies that are at the heart of this problem, even though people like, say, Larry Summers, a dyed-in-the-wool Clintonian Democrat, Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, even he is pointing this out. They don't want to admit to that. So, since they can't explain it any other way, they come up with a talk about, the inflation is going to be transitory. Well, I read reports that say inflation will be 7% by some point early next year. But of course, figures like that always beg the question of how you measure inflation. And I know that there are some people, and I'm not talking about, the very far way out people like John Williams at Shadow Stats, who've been saying inflation has always been much higher in the United States than it has been widely reported. I mean, he may be right, he may be wrong, I don't know. But I know that there are a lot of other people who already reckon that the true rate of inflation is above 7% now. Officially, it's 5.4%. But bear in mind, absences of goods in shops is a sign of inflation. It means that the price mechanism is breaking down, and that is preventing the movement of goods and services happening efficiently around the economy and around the country. So goods are not being supplied because, to some extent, at the moment, it's not economically wise to produce them because your costs of doing so are higher than the money you will get if you sell them. So until the whole thing adjusts, goods are being held back, and that is in itself a sign of inflation. Then, of course, you start to supply the goods when your own prices rise, but that creates more problems further down the line. And that's why you can get a situation of an economy contracting and inflation rising at one and the same time when you're trapped into this kind of inflation cycle.
Yeah. Meanwhile, trade with China is, or importing from China is at all-time highs.
Yeah, because the Chinese at the moment are still producing. I mean, they still have a manufacturing industry that's able to make things. But of course, they are becoming affected by the inflation too. I mean, we've seen energy shortages in China because, of course, one of the consequences of this massive surge in prices is that they're now feeding through into surges in prices of energy. And that's creating problems in China. So northern China, they've had power cuts and power outages there too. That's going to affect manufacturing in China. That will reduce the ability of China to manufacture goods to satisfy demand in the United States. That's going to create more shortages in the United States. That's going to lead to further problems in the United States. We are in a feedback loop, and it is not a good one.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, or is it a stretch to say Biden is wrecking the U.S. economy?
No, it's not a stretch. It is actually exactly what is happening. All you have to do is to go back to this situation in the economy at the start of this year. We were coming out of the very tough periods of restrictions. I have to use careful language. Tough periods of restrictions that we saw in 2020. The economy was starting to pick up speed, but it was, moving at an organic pace. Demand was moving forward at an organic pace. That is the right moment not to put your foot down on the accelerator. On the contrary, it's to try and throttle back a little, not to let growth surge too fast so that you create supply chain bottlenecks and problems and all of these sort of things. What the administration did was the diametric opposite. They are not people who have much experience, who have not much, they're not people who have any experience in production, in logistics, in moving goods around, in transportation, in any of those things. And the administration came in with a long list of things it was asked to do by the progressive wing, if you like, of the Democratic Party's coalition. So it ticked off all those boxes. It rammed its foot down on the accelerator. We had all these massive packages and vast amounts of money pouring into the economy. And they've done exactly what we at the Duran predicted. They've increased inflation, and what we did not predict, to the extent that it has, they're now causing the economy itself to stutter and indeed to start to break down. And the danger is that when you get into this cycle, as I said, it becomes self-reinforcing. There is a negative feedback loop. And at that point, things can get really very bad indeed. Sometimes the only way to get out of this kind of problem is to ram down the brake and stop the car completely, and then to restart the engine and to start again. In other words, to accept the need for a recession. That was what Paul Volcker did in the early 1980s when he raised interest rates to, double-digit figures in the United States. I think that there is no chance of that happening this time. I think the Democrats would go absolutely berserk if the Federal Reserve Board did any such thing. And they've been working hard to sort of undermine Jerome Powell's position at the Federal Reserve Board, precisely because they're worried that he might be thinking of doing something like that. So they're not going to do anything like that. We're going to see the whole thing clambering along, and we're going to see, as I said, a really, really bad situation in the economy with inflation next year. And it is highly likely that at some point, the underlying factors in the economy will themselves kick in, and we could have a recession. And that will not be the kind of recession that Paul Volcker engineered, which was a curative recession, very steep and very bad and very hard, though, for many people, that as it was. But this would be a totally destructive recession, one rather like the one that struck in 2008 during the financial crisis, one which is basically imposed on the economy by the economic numbers. So unless things change, unless there's a shift in course, of which I see no sign, I think the situation is going to get worse, and especially over the course of the winter, and we could very well be coming out of the winter with a very, very dire economic outlook before us indeed.
Yeah, my hunch tells me that the Democrats believe that they can drag this out till after the midterms and then pin all the blame on the Republicans. I mean, they know they're going to get slaughtered in the midterms. My hunch is telling me that they're trying to drag this out as much as they can so that they can shift the blame over to the Republicans when the recession does hit. So they'll avoid any type of engineered recession for the good of the country in their minds, in order to benefit them politically in 2022, 23, and up until the 2024 election. That's how they're seeing it, really from political vantage point.
I entirely agree. I think that's exactly correct. I think that's exactly the calculation now. I think the Democrats have quietly written off the midterms. I think they realize that there's no way to turn this thing round in time. I think they've seen the polling numbers, and I mean, they're becoming increasingly concerned about those, but I think they've realized that the midterms are now lost. What they're hoping is they will get a McConnell type rather than a, more hardline Trump, DeSantis type Republican Party gaining control of Congress. But whichever it is, they're going to try and blame it for the economic problems. And of course, they will still have the massive media information machine working round the clock to try and lock us all into that narrative, which we should not let ourselves be locked into, because it is wrong.
All right. So the Russian Energy Week that wrapped up. I think it's wrapped up by now, or it is wrapping up. Really interesting interview from CNBC's Hadley Gamble. I've never heard of her before.
No.
But okay, now she's kind of a household name, I guess, after her interview with Putin, which didn't go over too well because Putin was just crushed every single question she threw at him. But I want your thoughts on that. But let's segue a little into your thoughts on the Russia Energy Week by first you commenting on this title from RT, which says, Putin says the U.S. itself is killing the dollar as reserve currency by weaponizing sanctions and uncontrolled money printing, fueling inflation. Alexander, what do you make of Putin's statements? He did talk a lot about the energy crisis in Europe, as well as what's going on around the world. And he had some very interesting and insightful statements, as he always does. What do you make of that statement?
Absolutely, and of course, what it shows is the extent to which Putin today has become, if you like, the lodestar, and I'm going to say, of economic sanity, because when he talks about money emission, the extent to which money printing in the United States is running out of control, he is absolutely right. As we've just discussed on this program, the reason we have an inflation crisis today in the United States is because the United States, the administration, instead of, as I said, throttling back out of the pandemic, they did the opposite. They spent money like there is no tomorrow. And of course, that has created all the disruptions in the international economy that we are seeing. And of course, they are feeding into other economies too. Now, Russia, it must be said, is in better shape than most. It runs a budget surplus, which is growing. It runs a budget surplus, which is growing. It has massive funds now in its reserves. I mean, this has been the extraordinary thing. We've had years of sanctions, and Russian international reserves are now at record levels. The latest figure is $620 billion and rising fast. So, in a sense, the Russians are in a better shape than almost anyone else. But they also are affected by this worldwide increase in prices. It means that all the hard work that the Russians were doing over the previous 10 years to bring inflation down to around 4% and to keep it there have been undone over the last year because of the rate of money emission in the United States. And because Putin and the Russian government want long-term investment in Russia, he was very careful to say in that interview. By the way, I thought it was a better interview than some I've seen with American journalists, but we'll put that aside. But one of the points he made over the course of that interview is that the Russians have long-term, methodical, well-thought-out plans. They don't rush and change decisions and rush from one thing to another. They don't come up with, as he put it, populist proposals. In other words, he means by that demagogic proposals like, we're not going to have, we're going to extend Medicaid to everybody or things of that kind. I mean, he said we do things properly, we budget, we plan, we prepare. Well, that becomes much more difficult in a high inflation environment. So in one sense, the Russians are doing well. And in a way, this surge in prices in oil, in gas, in food products plays to many of the export strengths of their economy. But it also disrupts some of their long-term economic planning too. And one of the very interesting points that Putin made over the course of this Energy Week was that he actually wants to see less inflation. He would prefer to see lower prices for oil, lower prices for gas, lower prices for food products, because that would put the Russian economy back on a more sustainable long-term path. So he's criticizing the United States. He's saying the United States, the administration, is causing all these problems. Yes, we are better prepared than most. Yes, we're reaping some advantages from it. But overall, like the rest of the world, we would be better off if the United States returned to economic sanity. Now, he didn't put it quite as strongly as I've just done, but that's clearly what he thinks.
Now, if you had watched our shows that we did on the energy crisis in Europe and some of the Kremlin's remarks leading up to the Russian Energy Week, and you had watched that interview with CNBC and Hadley Gamble, very interesting name, Hadley Gamble, you would have recognized many of the statements that Putin made really were in agreement with our analysis as well. I mean, he really did. He once again explained to CNBC that, we are not to blame for any of this, of the energy crisis that's taking place in Europe or the world. Stop trying to blame it on us. What we're actually doing is we're actually increasing our output. You're blocking Nord Stream 2 on the one hand. On the other hand, you want to give more energy to Europe. We're increasing our output by 10, 15%. What's going on with Ukraine right now has nothing to do with energy and more to do with politics, and that they won't upgrade their pipelines and their infrastructure. So it makes it near next to impossible to operate an efficient pipeline running through Ukraine as well. And I mean, he really just shut down all of our questioning with regards to Russia's to blame for the energy crisis. I mean, he really shut it down in classic Putin fashion with numbers, statistics, and a very clear explanation how energy works. I think at one point during the interview, he even said, it's not about, it's not something I can just turn on and off, sending gas to Europe. He said, it's not that simple. We need to have he was like telling her, trying to explain to her. At one point, he even said, you know, you're krasiva debushka, you're a beautiful woman, but you're not listening to my answers. And that was kind of a light moment in the interview. But he made the point, you're not listening to me. Give us the contracts, sign the deals, tell us how much you need, and we'll fulfill them, as we have always done through all our history, going back to the Soviet time.
Exactly. That's exactly what he was saying. And that was, by the way, a fascinating exchange when he made that comment about Hadley Gamble, whom also I've never come across, by the way. But he made the point. What he showed is, look, Russia has actually increased its exports of gas to Europe. The United States has cut them. That was the point he was making.
Yes,
so,
he said that.
Why are you blaming us? We are increasing our supplies. You, the United States, are reducing them. So what is the issue? Why are you blaming us for a gas shortage when we're doing everything that we can within reason, and you know, to the extent that it's possible for us to try to solve this problem, and the only people who are cutting back on gas are you. And she didn't seem to understand that. It seemed to be so completely beyond her capacity to grasp it. She was lost. There's been some really interesting articles, and you know, this is obviously Putin made all of those entirely valid points, but there was a really good article by a man called Ben Aris, and he pointed out again. I mean, you know, the way people talk is that Putin, you know, can send gas from one place in Russia to another place in Russia to, you know, through Ukraine. He can just move gas around effortlessly. He can pull it out of the ground whenever he wants. He can do all kinds of things with it, as if, you know, he can just conjure up this gas out of thin air. And it doesn't work like that. This is an enormously complex, very demanding industry. But you have to have pipelines. You have to have pipelines to proper fields, gas fields. You have to. It's a high-tech, highly managed industry operating over gigantic distances. You can't just move gas around in the way that some people in the West are saying. And you can't just switch off the gas and then switch it back on again at some people's needs. By the way, on this one issue, he seems to have, Putin has had some support from none other than Angela Merkel, who, probably for political reasons of her own, has also weighed in and has said that the Russians have always fulfilled their gas contracts, and anybody who has made long-term gas contracts with them is now in a strong position and doesn't need to worry. It's all of those people who refused to make long-term gas contracts, who thought that they would be able to get by buying gas on the spot market, who now find themselves in trouble. And that is not of Russia's making, as Putin labored to point out. Give us contracts, give us long lead times, and we can satisfy and provide you with all the gas you need. And he also made some very interesting figures. He pointed out that Europe produces around 54 billion cubic meters of gas a year. Gazprom produces 500 billion cubic meters of gas a year. And Gazprom's gas reserves, Russia's gas reserves, run into trillions, far more than everyone else. That they are, as Putin put it, of planetary dimensions. So the Russia and natural gas is going to become, as you know, we move the shift away from coal and oil continues. It's going to become an ever more important part of the energy mix. So, given that this is so, the right thing to do, given the problems with renewables, and given also the issues many people have with nuclear power, the obvious thing to do is to sort out long-term gas contracts with Russia. And that's so obvious. It's so difficult to understand. I mean, the other thing they might want to consider doing, I understand that there are all these ideological and safety concerns, but they might also consider building more nuclear power stations. But if they're not prepared to do that, then they're going to have to make even more long-term
He
gas
talked
deals
about that,
with
yeah.
Russia. Yeah.
That was
I
also a
mean,
question. He talked about that. He made a really excellent point. He brought in geography, and I really like that. Putin has a really good way of explaining things.
yeah,
If people would listen to him more instead of
yeah,
demonizing him,
yeah.
people you would learn a lot about what's going on in the world. I mean, I do, and he made a really excellent point. And then we'll get to Durham and McCabe and all that stuff that's going on in the U.S. We'll go back to the U.S., but we'll end it on this, Alexander. He made an excellent point when he brought up geography. He said, look, in Russia, big country, some regions we build reactors, others we don't, but we have a lot of distance between certain regions,
Yeah.
and we don't have a problem with it with our energy
Yeah.
diversification.
Yeah.
You know, we build energy. We build different types of energy in different types of regions as we see fit. And then he made the point. He says, I don't understand why Germany is not diversified enough and is so against nuclear when literally right next door to them, you have France and Macron, who are now going full into nuclear, and they're even going to start building small reactors now. That's Macron's latest plan, to build small regional reactors all over France. And Putin's like, Europe is so crammed together. We have some countries which we're not going to touch reactors, other countries which have them. And the distance is much less than the distances we have in Russia. Should there be any issues, say, with the environment or safety or stuff like that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's entirely right. I mean, that's the point he makes. But of course, the objection to nuclear power, and it is a very powerful one, comes from the very various green parties that are now so powerful in Europe, and which are viscerally, monolithically hostile to nuclear power. Whenever it's suggested that Europe turn to nuclear power, there is enormous opposition to doing this. And Macron may be going in one direction, but there's lots of people in France who are of green who have a green outlook, who are opposed to him on this. And of course, if we're talking about Britain and Germany, well, I mean, Germany has phased out all its nuclear power stations because the Greens are so powerful in Germany. And in Britain, the Blair government, to give credit where it's due, did have an ambitious policy of building nuclear power stations. But in came David Cameron, the Conservative Prime Minister. He wanted to appeal to people of green outlook in Britain. He wanted to win them over to the Conservative Party, which he was actually quite successful in doing. And one of the things he did was he sacrificed the entire nuclear program that the Blair government had bequeathed him. So in effect, Britain's nuclear power industry, which is one of the strongest in Europe, way back in the 60s, is now almost at crisis point. It's almost entirely collapsed. Now, Putin made many points about the rational balance of Russia's energy policy, the fact that because the Russians have developed their energy mix around natural gas and nuclear power, their carbon footprint is actually much lower than it is the case in some European countries, and by the way, the United States. He's also, and this is perhaps not so much in this interview, but in some of the speeches he's made and in some discussions he's had, he's made clear his utter exasperation and annoyance at being lectured by countries which have more carbon emissions than Russia does about, all these issues about carbon emissions. He is really, really annoyed about this. But a point which he did not make, but which I'm going to make, you hear about supply problems, you hear about supply shortages, you hear about labor shortages in many countries. You don't hear about them in Russia. There's no sign of any, problems with energy supply. Obviously, it's an energy producer. I don't hear of any problems with any kind of supply. The lights are on in Russia. The shops are fully stocked. There's no sign of anything like that happening there. Why? Because they run a conventional economic policy, just as the kind that we used to have once upon a time in the United States and the West, when our economies were run rationally.
Yeah, just like 7-8 months ago. What happened 7-8 months ago to change everything? Anyway, and that leads us back to the U.S. Alexander, 7-8 months ago, probably 4 years ago when the whole Russiagate thing started. And the big story, of course, was the DNC hack. That DNC hack by the Russian hackers, of course, which was never really investigated by the FBI, but was outsourced, Alexander. And we've got some information there. And you sent me a story. And once again, let me share my screen real quick. And I will pull up a story here with a title that says, John Durham and the amazing disappearing DNC hack. Evidence grows that the alleged Russian hacking of the DNC server in 2016 was an inside job. Wow. Get into this story, Alexander. What a title and what a byline.
Yeah, no, we'll find out whether we ever reach the point of having that properly investigated. But what that article does, and it makes the kind of connections that people ought to be making an awful lot more than they have been making, which is that, of course, the whole story about the DNC hack and the fact that the Russians supposedly hacked the DNC computers and exfiltrated all those emails, gave them to Julian Assange, who gave them to WikiLeaks, who published them. So that story, which was, the heart story, the key story that led to everything else. Well, none of what you said, it wasn't really investigated. Actually, it wasn't investigated at all, because the FBI didn't go in, they didn't look at the servers, they didn't do any kind of examinations, they didn't check out what they were being told. They accepted a version of events given to them by the Democrats and by a company that the Democrats employed called CrowdStrike, which produced a report which they never completed, which said that it was the Russians who did that. The FBI never looked beyond that. And who were the people who were promoting this story to the FBI? All the same people who Durham has pointed out in his most recent indictment peddled the now utterly discredited Alpha Bank story. And the parallels are really very striking. I mean, we have all these people who come up with all these tech ideas. They come along to the FBI. The FBI accepts them, carries out investigations in relation to the one which quickly collapsed. They don't do any investigations at all with the other. They accept the word of the same people. And in the case of Perkins Coie, Fusion GPS, all of those people, well, it turns out that on the Alpha Bank situation, they were utterly and completely wrong. And Durham pretty much implies in his indictment that they were straightforwardly lying. So if they would do that with the Alpha Bank story, why wouldn't they do the same with the DNC hack story? And in fact, the idea that it was all an internal leak is what WikiLeaks has always said. And there's been all sorts of people, including some very senior people, very well-informed people who understand these technical things, who've been making that same point all along. So we will see. We will see whether Durham ever gets there. But at the moment, he seems to be edging in that direction. He hasn't quite led to it. But what he has exposed is the extent to which the FBI was being willingly manipulated, if you like, by the Democrats.
Yeah, that would not only blow apart the entire Russiagate narrative, which I think has already been sufficiently blown apart.
Yeah,
that would mean that the FBI was, to a certain extent, being weaponized by the Clinton campaign against an opposing candidate.
Well, it was. I mean, it's straightforwardly. That's exactly what appears to have been happening. I mean, the Clinton campaign and its various operatives, Fusion GPS, Perkins Coie, all the rest, Christopher Steele, Orbis, you name it. They were coming along. They were feeding information to the FBI, and the FBI was undertaking investigations based on that information, even though the FBI would have had every cause and reason to know who was providing this information, and the fact that they were doing it on Hillary Clinton's behalf. So the Democrats were using the FBI to investigate their political opponent, who was Donald Trump.
It's yeah. I mean, we've known all along that this is the truth that we need to get to, but we may actually be getting to it, and that's good news.
We're getting closer in the sense that
Yeah.
Durham has published this extraordinary indictment. As I said, the indictment itself is fascinating because, as I said, the person it goes against is just a very minor, well, a minor player in this affair. The Perkins Coie lawyer, but he has gone for this very expansive 27-page indictment, which seems to suggest that there are many other threads and lines of inquiry that this is all leading up to. But we have to say this, there's also pushback. And the latest pushback, as of course you know, is that Andrew McCabe, who was the FBI deputy director, who seems to have been right at the center of all of this, he's now had his pension reinstated. This is despite the fact that he came in under severe criticism from the FBI's own Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, and that the entire way in which the FBI conducted itself has come under massive criticism from Michael Horowitz, who is, as I said, the FBI's own Inspector General. And I can't help but feel that this decision to reinstate McCabe's pension, which was made as part of a settlement of a court case, is partly a signal to Durham to tread very carefully, because at the moment the current administration, doesn't want what happened at the FBI and the FBI's role in this affair, the Russiagate affair, to be looked at too closely. And it wants to make it clear to Durham that the administration is going to stand behind all the people who were working at the FBI. McCabe, obviously, Comey, probably, Strzok, Lisa Page, all of those people. They have the backing of the administration, of the Justice Department, of the Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Garland, and all the rest. So this is, I think, a shot across Durham's bows. It's a warning to him that the administration is going to fight, and they're going to fight to protect the FBI. They're going to fight to protect the Hillary Clinton campaign. They're going to fight to protect the DNC. And of course, these are people who have it in their power to sack Durham whenever they choose.
Yeah, they're basically telling him to back off. Enough.
Exactly.
You've got in your low hanging fruit. Now back off. That's what they're telling him.
Yeah. Now it could be that he's going to play a long game, that he's going to wait until the run up to the midterms to announce more indictments then. And of course, that would be very difficult. That become more politically difficult at that point for the Democrats to act against Durham. If he did that in advance of the midterms, then of course, when the midterms happen, if the Republicans gain control of Congress, then of course, if the administration tries to sack Durham at that point, or restrict what he can do, then he might be able to call on the Republicans in Congress for support. So there may be a political game being played out that we don't know. But clearly, this decision to reinstate McCabe's pension is a political signal. It's a warning from the administration, from the Democrats to Durham, that the administration is not going to let this happen. It's not going to let it take its course. Each too has read this indictment that Durham has published. They're aware now of the danger that he may represent, and they're warning him to back off.
Yeah, timing is everything. So whatever happens, if Durham is going to reveal the truth about all of this stuff, then he needs to time it just right. And we've waited 3-4 years for the truth to come out. So if he does decide to play a long game and wait just another year, then why not? It sounds like the right move to make. But I always say it with a little bit of a caveat in that I don't have that much faith and trust in the Republicans either. So, nothing's settled.
Or indeed, I have to say this also in John Durham himself. I
Yeah.
mean, he's played it very low, very slow, very quiet. Now, there might be tactical reasons for that, but we've also heard reports that he's not going after the CIA, for example. He seems in his latest indictment to be holding off from attacking the FBI itself. All of that suggests to me that, we can't rely that he's really going to pursue an aggressive investigation to look into all of this in any very great detail. But so we can't, unfortunately, rely on Durham. But having said that, I agree. If he's playing a long game, which he may be, if he's playing a long game, if he's going to wait a year, well, we waited a long time. We can certainly wait a year to get to the truth.
Yeah. All right. We will end it there. We covered a lot of good topics, Alexander. And I hope that everyone that is watching this and everyone in the chat, whether you're on the YouTube chat or if you are joining us on the Duran.locals.com in that chat, I hope you enjoyed this premiere. Alexander, how do you think the premiere went?
I think it went marvelous. I mean, look at how much ground we've covered. But always there is a thread that united all those three stories: RussiaGate, the Putin, the energy at the energy conference, and of course the problems of the economy. And that is the political agenda of the Democratic Party. And it is a very disruptive agenda. It is creating massive ructions. It's creating problems within US law enforcement and in the intelligence community. Well, problems is, I think, the biggest understatement I've ever made, actually, because, I mean, I think it's created a crisis in the intelligence community and law enforcement. And it is creating a crisis in the US economy and in the economy worldwide. And perhaps the point to finish is what Putin said about the dollar. He made the absolutely valid point, which you mentioned earlier, that US policy, both the economic policies the US is following and this absolutely demented use of sanctions are ultimately undermining the trust in the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And he made the point that the United States is sawing off the branch of the tree it is sitting on, because it is taking steps, reckless steps with its economy, reckless steps with the dollar as it pursues its foreign policies. And those are undermining, ultimately, the position of the United States itself. And that is the thread that links all the parts of this program, of this premium program that we have done today. An administration that is becoming increasingly reckless, is becoming increasingly irresponsible, and at some levels even irrational.
Yeah. All right. We will end it there. The Duran.locals.com, everybody. And a quick plug for our merch, the Duran shop. 10% off.
You can see
when you use the code.
With here I have my magic mug with the flag of the United States, the great American Republic, of which I have been such a fan for so much of my life.
All right, you'll find 10% off. Use the code Real News in the description box down below. Take care, everybody, and we'll be back with a live stream, most likely on Monday, maybe Tuesday, but I will make an announcement before that. Take care.